Can you sell a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island? Yes. But there's a version of the sale that closes in 6 months at full price, and there's a version that turns into an 18-month legal nightmare with $30,000 in legal fees, zero rent coming in, and a house you can't sell. I'm Eric Berman, an associate broker with Compass Greater New York, and I've handled this exact deal on Long Island 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's just say more times than I can even count. And today I'm walking you through the story of how selling a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island actually plays out. The moment most landlords realize that their tenant has more leverage than they thought, where tenants are actually learning what to do, and it's probably not where you think they are. One sentence that cost Long Island landlords their leverage in a single phone call, the strategy attorneys quietly recommend instead of eviction, and how to price a Long Island rental with tenants in place, because it changes everything. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to handle this before you say a single word to your tenant. A quick disclaimer, I'm not your attorney, I'm not your accountant. New York landlord tenant laws, it's complicated. Statewide law changed with the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act in 2000. There's also a good cause eviction law from 2024 that applies to New York City and to any Long Island municipalities that opts in. Which so far none have, but every single situation is going to be specific to that. And I would want you to verify anything I say today with a real estate attorney who handles Long Island landlord tenant matters. Cool? All right, let's go. Before I get into the story, let me tell you what almost every Long Island landlord I've worked with gets wrong on day one. They think they have the leverage. They think because they own the house, they control the outcome. They don't. The moment a tenant is in a New York property, the leverage sits somewhere very different from where the landlord thinks it does. And when you're selling a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island, that's the single most important thing to understand. Get that wrong, you lose 12 to 18 months of your life. Get it right, and you're at a closing table in 6 months with a full market check. That is what this video is about. All right, so I'm gonna tell you about a deal I did recently. I'm gonna change some of the details so that I don't get in trouble and so nobody feels like they're being singled out. But the arc of it is the arc of most of these deals. Okay, so I got a call from a landlord on Nassau County. They owned a rental, a single family house for about 12 years, solid tenant. They've been in the house about 6 of those years, paid rent on time, reasonable person. The landlord was, they're getting a little bit older and he wanted out. He didn't want to be a landlord anymore. So he wanted to sell, pay off some other things and simplify his life. The house had appreciated pretty significantly. He was sitting on some real equity and he was ready to go. He called me and asked me the question you've probably typed into YouTube to find this video. Can I sell this rental with the tenant still living in it? And I told him, absolutely, yes, of course you can. And then I told him the part he wasn't ready for. The moment you tell your tenant this house is going up for sale, the dynamic between you and your tenant is going to change. And guess what? He laughed at me. He said, no, we're good. She's a great tenant, she'll understand. I told him, I understand, and I hope you're right, but you're not the first landlord I heard say that. So here's what happened next. But let me back up for a second, because to understand why the story went the way it did, you have to understand the legal framework. When you sell a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island, one thing is legally certain. That lease survives the sale. Whatever lease the tenant signed with you, the new owner inherits. Same rent, same terms, same security deposit. The tenant's rights don't disappear because the house changed hands. If the tenant has 8 months left on the lease, the buyer is buying the house with a tenant in it with 8 months left. The new owner steps into your shoes as the landlord. That's it. If the tenant is month to month, no active lease, the buyer has more flexibility. But there are still specific notice requirements the new owner has to follow. Tenant in the unit less than 1 year, at least 30 days notice. Between 1 and 2 years, at least 60 days. More than 2 years, at least 90 days. They're real notice periods baked into New York state law, and it applies everywhere on Long Island. Now, here's the piece most landlords don't fully appreciate, but the tenant knows, not because the tenant walked in with an attorney on retainer. Most tenants don't call an attorney first. They do what everybody does when they don't know something, right? They ask a friend who's been through it. They Google it. They end up on Reddit. And that's actually part of the story most landlords don't see coming, because there are Reddit threads, hundreds of them, where tenants share exactly what to say when a landlord tells them the house is being sold, exactly what their rights are in New York, and exactly how long an eviction takes, and exactly what they can ask for. I'll come back to Reddit in a few minutes, because what tenants are going to learn on those threads is going to become the entire pivot point of this story. For now, understand this. By the time the tenant calls an attorney, if they call one at all, they usually already know what they want. They've done the research, they know the timeline, they know where the leverage is. And that's the reality of selling a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island in 2026. So, let's get back to my landlord in Nassau County story. So he called me a week after we first talked. He told the tenant he had a completely different tone. The tenant hadn't screamed at him. The tenant hadn't threatened him. The tenant had simply said, okay, I need to think about this. Let me have my attorney reach out. Her attorney reached out 3 days later. The message was calm, professional, and clear. Hey, my client has been a wonderful tenant for 6 years. She has rights under New York state law that survive any sale. We'd like to discuss what a fair resolution looks like. Translation: we know what your options are. We know how long an eviction would take. We're going to be part of the conversation about what happens next. I want to be clear about something. The tenant in the story didn't do anything wrong. She wasn't being unreasonable. She wasn't being a villain. She was a person with a home she'd lived in for 6 years who had just been told she might have to leave. She hired an attorney. Anybody in her situation would. That's not tenant bad behavior. That's how the system is designed to work. But the landlord, who a week earlier had told me that they were friendly, just realized this was no longer a friendly conversation. This was a legal conversation with leverage on the other side of the table. Every day he waited to figure out his next move was another day the tenant's attorney got to shape the outcome. Here's the moment in the story where the landlord had to make a real decision. He had 3 options. Option 1, go to court, file to terminate the tenancy, fight it out in the Nassau County landlord-tenant court system. The reality of that option is 12 to 18 months minimum, sometimes longer. Between the 14-day notice requirements, court backlogs in Nassau and Suffolk landlord-tenant courts, tenant defenses, adjournments, warrants of eviction, wait times, marshal or sheriff schedulings for the actual removal, legal fees somewhere between $10,000 and $30,000 or more, plus 0 rent coming in during the process. And even if the tenant keeps paying, the landlord can't sell. The house is frozen. At the end of it, if he wins, he can finally sell. But if he's a year and a half older, $25,000 later, and exhausted, option 2, sell with a tenant in place, which is legal, which happens all the time. But the buyer pool for a tenant-occupied house is not the buyer pool for a vacant house. Most owner-occupant buyers, the ones who want to live in the house themselves, won't touch a house with a tenant in place because they can't move in, because the lease survives the sale. That leaves investor buyers, and investor buyers know they're the only game in town when the house is tenant-occupied. So they price accordingly. The offer comes in lower, sometimes 10, 15, 20% lower than what the vacant house would sell for. So for a $700,000 house for a Long Island rental, that's $140,000 walking out the door because the tenant is still there. Option 3, cash for keys. Remember I was talking about Reddit threads before, and I told you here's what's on those threads. Cash for keys, described in detail. So how much to ask for, that's what you'll see in those threads. How to negotiate it, how to make sure it's documented properly. Tenants, especially in expensive markets like Nassau and Suffolk, increasingly walk into these conversations already knowing what cash for keys is. Sometimes they know before the landlord does. Cash for keys is exactly what it sounds like. The landlord offers the tenant a lump sum of money in exchange for the tenant voluntarily vacating the property by an agreed upon date. It's negotiated, it's documented in writing by both attorneys, it's signed by both parties, and it's legal. The tenant leaves with money in hand, the landlord gets the house back vacant, the house sells for what a vacant house is worth. Everybody moves on. The math on cash for keys for most Long Island landlords is not close. Compare eviction, 12 to 18 months, $10,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, zero rent, house frozen, buyer pool restricted. The entire time, cash for keys, 30 to 90 days, a negotiated payment, house delivered vacant, a full buyer pool at full market pricing. Even if the cash for keys number is $10,000, $15,000, $25,000, it's often the cheapest path to the fastest sale. And that's why experienced landlord tenant attorneys frequently recommend it. Not because it's a workaround, because it's the number that actually favors the best outcome for the landlord. My landlord in Nassau County, he took option 3. He offered the tenant a number. The tenant countered. Right in the range of what the Reddit threads had told her to ask for, they settled somewhere in the middle. The tenant vacated 8 weeks later, and on the day they agreed to, the tenant vacated 8 weeks later. On the day that they agreed, the house went to market 2 weeks after that, sold in 3 weeks at full market price, closed 45 days later. From the day he first called me to the day he wired his check to his attorney, about 6 months. If he had gone the eviction route, he might still be waiting. The difference between the two outcomes was one decision made in one phone call with an attorney before he ever said a word to his tenant. A quick note, if this is helping, hit subscribe. I publish content like this for Long Island landlords, homeowners, buyers, sellers every week. So just, if it helps, go ahead and hit subscribe. Now let's get back to it. Now, here's the part that I need every Long Island landlord to hear. The one sentence that costs Long Island landlords their leverage in a single phone call. I'm going to sell. Not to your tenant, not until you've talked to a real estate attorney first, because the moment you say that sentence, before you've thought through your strategy, you've handed the tenant the leverage. You've triggered their research. You've started their clock. You've committed publicly to a plan you haven't actually built. Say that sentence too early, and you've already lost a chunk of your equity before the process even starts. The right order when you're selling a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island: 1, talk to a real estate attorney who handles Long Island landlord-tenant matters. 2, understand your specific tenant situation, active lease, length of tenancy, notice requirements. 3, talk to a Long Island real estate agent about the difference between selling occupied versus vacant in your specific price point. 4, model out the 3 options: court, sell occupied, cash for keys with real numbers. 5, decide on your strategy. And then 6, and then and only then, have the conversation with your tenant. The landlord who skips steps 1 through 5 and jumps right to 6 are the landlords who call me a month later frustrated because now the tenant has done their research and the landlord doesn't have a strategy and they've lost every ounce of leverage that they walked in with. Don't be that landlord. One more thing that comes up on almost every one of these calls: landlords who own multiple rentals often ask me if they can 1031 exchange the sale of a tenant-occupied rental into their next investment property. The answer, generally, yes. A 1031 exchange lets you defer capital gains tax on the sale of an investment property by rolling the proceeds into another investment property under the specific IRS timelines. Whether the property you're selling has a tenant in it or is vacant doesn't change the 1031 rules themselves. But the timing of your sale, which depends heavily on your tenant strategy, absolutely affects whether you can hit your 1031 identification and replacement windows. If eviction stretches your sale timeline out 18 months, you're not doing a 1031. You're holding a frozen asset. If cash for keys gets you to a clean sale in 90 days, you have a real 1031 window. That's another reason why the exit strategy matters more than the sale itself. Talk to your CPA about whether a 1031 makes sense for you or your specific situation. And a quick note, if you're watching from outside of Long Island or Queens, we can still help you. I have a fully vetted agent in every city across the country, and they are ready to go. We will interview them for you to make sure that it's the right fit. If you want to do that, go ahead and click the link in the description. Tell me where you are and what you need, and I'll connect you with somebody great. Whether it's buying, selling an investment property, or you just want to have an honest conversation or walk through your options, we've got you covered. So, can you sell a rental house with tenants living in it on Long Island? Yes, you can. But how you approach it decides whether you're selling in 6 months at full market price or you're going to be in a fight for 18 months in court while your equity sits frozen. Look, these are conversations that you need to have. And if you want to have a one-on-one conversation with me about your options in a little bit more detail, go ahead, click the link in the description. You can schedule a call directly into my calendar and we can have that honest conversation. If there's anything else you want to talk about, you can reach me there. But until the next time, I'll see you here.